Welcome everyone to another video discussion of free answer writing program by Vajiram and Ravi. In this month, we are going to see GS1, History, Society and Geography. Today, we are going to see questions from GS1, Society. Specifically, we are going to see topic of role of women and women's organization. Now, let's see all the question. Firstly, we have a question on women's participation in labor force. So, we are going to see there are certain kind of factors which are limiting the participation of women in labor force, and thus we are going to discuss that topic. In the second question, we are going to see how digital divide is negatively impacting women and how online learning can help with respect to women education. And third question is a current affair question where we are going to see recently how the issue of antimicrobial resistance is on rise and what are the kind of concerns with respect to the same and what are the measures that can be taken to address the issue. So this is something for today's question. Let's start with very first question. Let's read the first question together. The absence of an enabling and safe working environment is responsible for poor participation of women in the labor force. Discuss. Now as the directive word is discuss, you have the opportunity to extend this debate as well. As the very first statement that you can see is absence of enabling and safe working environment is responsible for the poor participation of women in labor force. Now this exactly is the demand 1. So that is going to be your heading 1 of the body. But we do understand that that is not the only factor that limits participation of women in labor force. So for heading 2, we are going to see other factors as well. So if you structure this answer, in the introduction, you have the potential to talk about the data point, to talk about the kind of participation rate of women in labor force. In the body, in the heading 1, we will talk about the absence of enabling and safe working environment as a reason. In heading 2, we are going to see the other factors for the reason, and in the conclusion, you can talk about certain measures as in way ahead, that how can we ensure certain kind of implementation of things are in place to ensure participation of women is realized. So let's start with the introduction. In the introduction, you have the opportunity to talk about data. We have data points of periodic labor force survey of 2022-23. We have seen that how women's labor force is increasing and has now reached at 37%. But you have to relatively understand that how this number is almost half compared to the male counterpart. As in, the male labor force participation rate is 78.5%. So this shows that there is asymmetry with respect to participation in labor force gender wise. So that is something you can write in the introduction. In the transition line, you can talk about that how there are various reasons. One of the primary reason is absence of enabling and safe working environment. Thus, in the heading 1, over here, you can expand the same about absence of enabling and safe working environment. You can talk about that how there is high degree of sexual violence and sexual harassment at workplace. That exactly is disabling factor for labor force participation rate. Second, you can talk about there is gender gap. Now over here, you can understand that women are paid almost 20% less compared to the male counterpart. That kind of asymmetry in payment in the wage disincentivizes women to participate in the labor force, as there are certain kind of unequal structures. Third, you have unorganized sector. Over here, we have understanding that most of the women, they are part of unorganized sector where they do not have any kind of social protection. That kind of limiting factor also disincentivizes for women to participate in the labor force. Next is lack of role model and mentor, as we do understand that at the leadership position, we have hardly women leaders, and that kind of data point kind of disincentivize or discourages women to take part in the labor force. And lastly, in the leadership role, we have seen the glass ceiling effect where women, they are not promoted on par with the men. So these are the kind of disabling and unsafe working environment condition because of which women do not participate in the labor force. Now in the heading 2, you have the opportunity to talk about other factors as well, which are kind of factors for poor participation of women in labor force. Firstly, you can talk about there are certain educational barriers, as we have seen that how in the traditional Indian society there are certain kind of norms. We have seen that how there is son meta preference, and because of that kind of attitude, women are not encouraged to pursue educational journey. Second, there are social and cultural norms. Over here we are talking about that how women is ideally considered to be a housewife, or they do not have any kind of economic empowerment or any kind of opportunity to work outside of home. So there are certain kind of traditional role allocation with respect to women, which disincentivizes them or discourages them to take part in the labor force participation. Next, we have legal and policy barrier. We do not have affirmative action with respect to work. So those are the kind of barrier that can also have disadvantage over here. Next, health and safety concern. As we have seen that there are certain places where we have seen that health and safety are not considered, the structures are not made considering women's requirement. And next, we have technological and digital divide. Now this kind of asymmetry in access to technology, which is digital divide, can also hampers women's potential to realize those opportunity for employment. So these are the kind of factors that you can write in the heading 2 of the body. In the conclusion, you have the potential and the opportunity to talk about way ahead. You can talk about that how there is need for sensitization of the society as well as recurring training of the workplace, so that they can understand women's issue, they can understand how they have to treat women and lose the patriarchal attitude. So these are the kind of proof points that you can add over here as way ahead as in the measures. So sensitization and training is something you can add over here. So this is all for question number 1. Let's see the model answer and understand how can we inculcate the same in our answer writing practice. Firstly, you can talk about certain data points. You can talk about the periodic labor force survey, and you can also do a comparison of women and men to give the full picture. Then you can talk about absence of enabling safe working environment and list down the point with other factors as well. And in the conclusion, you can talk about what are the kind of measures that are required to bridge the gap. So that is all for question number 1. Let's move on to question number 2. In question number 2, let's read the question together. Digital divide is negatively impacting women in India. In what ways can online learning help in promoting women's education in India? Now, as you can see, the question is having 2 demands. Firstly, digital divide is negatively impacting women in India. This is heading 1. And the second is, in what ways can online learning help in promoting women's education? Now, this is heading 2. So, in the introduction, you can start with the context, you can start with the data point, how there is digital divide and how it is impacting women. And the heading 1 of the body, you can talk about the negative impact of digital divide. And in the heading 2, you can talk about how online education can help with respect to women's education. And lastly, in the conclusion, you have the opportunity to talk about certain initiatives by government or way ahead. Let's start with the introduction. Over here, you can talk about certain context. You can talk about that how National Family Health Survey shows that there is urban-rural gender gap in internet use, where almost less than 3, almost 2.5 is the number out of 10 in women in 10 women in rural India, and 4 out of 10 women in urban India don't use internet. So that is something which survey says. You can start with that kind of proof points. In the body, in the heading 1, we are going to enlist all the impacts that are because of digital divide. Firstly, you can talk about the issue of access. As we mentioned that men are twice likely to be using the internet. That kind of asymmetry in the access impacts women's opportunities, the potential for her to realize the opportunities. Next, it also sets certain kind of norms. We already are witnessing that how there is son meta preference and women are not treated on par with the men. Now digital divide further augments that kind of gap and creates certain kind of trends. Next, we can talk about that how there is sub-national disparity as well with respect to digital divide. There are certain states where the digital divide is less, and there are certain states where the digital divide is relatively higher. This kind of asymmetry, regional wise, also reflects certain kind of cultural context as well as certain kind of resource limitation. And lastly, there is impact on direct psyche of the women, that is lack of confidence. As they do not have access to certain kind of information, they will definitely feel that they are limited by this kind of resource limitation, and thus we can understand how it impacts the entire journey of women's life. So that is something for impact of digital divide on women, and that is how we have to cater to the next body, which is how online learning helps with respect to women's education. Firstly, it breaks barrier. We do understand that online learning platforms, they provide the education at affordable as well as accessible way. So it breaks down historical barriers, as in the asymmetry that we saw with respect to sun meta preference. Then we are also talking about that how it helps with respect to participation of women. There are certain reports which represent that most of the learners, they are women, and that is the kind of incentivization process that helps with respect to participation. Next, it also helps with respect to employment and jobs. We do understand education leads to skill, and those skills can be translated for economic advantage. Next, we are also looking at certain kind of breaking of barriers with certain fields like STEM field. We are looking at that how there is increase in participation of women in STEM field due to access of online education. And also we are talking about cost, that how online education comes at an affordable cost and thus helps with respect to the access problem. So that is all for heading 2 of the body. Now let us see the conclusion. In the conclusion, you have the opportunity to write way ahead. Over here, we can again talk about certain kind of sensitization of the society, where we must have certain kind of equal structures. Again, you can talk about that how there is need for behavioral nudge from every member of the society. We have although initiated Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao type of yojana, where we are encouraging women's participation in the education. Now that kind of encouragement needs certain kind of concrete steps, and those concrete steps comes from certain kind of processes such as online education. Now, not just limiting to online education, we also must ensure that every kind of resources are accessible to every gender. So that is something you can write in the conclusion of question number 2. Let us see the model answer and understand how can we inculcate the same in our answer writing practice. Firstly, you can talk about certain issues as in the context of the question where digital divide is limiting women's education. Then you can talk about the impact of digital divide on women, where you can list down different keywords and substantiation. Next, you can talk about the influence as a solution for online education for women. Here you can list down how exactly it's influencing women's education. And lastly, you can talk about that how there is need for sensitization as well as empowerment of women, and thus they need to be given access to digital tools to ensure there is equality in the society. So that is all for question number 2. Let's move on to question number 3, which is a current affair based question. Let's read the question together. Antimicrobial resistance threatens global health, necessitating urgent and collaborative efforts to preserve the effectiveness of essential drugs. In light of the statement, mention concerns related to AMR and measures that can be taken to address the issue. If you read the question, very first topic talks about the urgency, the idea with respect to that we have to tackle, which is AMR, antimicrobial resistance. Now it is a global issue and it is directly impacting the effectiveness of essential drugs. So that has direct impact on the health of the masses. Over here in this question, we have to talk about the concerns related to AMR, which is going to be the heading 1 of the answer in the body, and measures to be taken would be the heading 2 of the body. In the introduction, you have the potential and the opportunity to talk about the recent context. Over here, you can cite different kind of data points as well. You can talk about it how, as per the Lancet journal, there are 1.5 million human deaths related to AMR. You can talk about that how that is impacting the entire world. Second, you can talk about that how it is impacting India, where we are witnessing almost 60,000 newborn deaths annually because of bacterial and AMR. So these are the kind of proof points that you can write in the introduction. Now let us move on to the body. In the body, in the heading 1, you can get a direct demand of the question, which is concerns related to AMR. Over here, you can list down various proof points. Firstly, there is high burden of infectious disease. Over here, we are talking about that how there is issue with respect to loss of treatment effectiveness, as the essential drugs, they tend to become useless because of AMR. We also seen that how there are certain impact on medical procedures, because of which that we are not able to treat the AMR. And second, it increases the morbidity and mortality. Now all this encompasses as high burden of infectious disease. The next is over the counter availability. We do have the concern, the biggest concern about this part is that how people are accessing the essential drugs from medical shop without any proof from specific medical practitioners. Next, we have also an issue of agricultural practices where there is rampant use of essential drug for certain kind of increase in yield, profit, etc. We also have limited surveillance and regulation with respect to the essential drugs and how they can become less effective due to AMR. Next, we have inadequate sanitation and hygiene. We do understand that Swachh Bharat Abhiyan is definitely going towards success, but despite that, we have issues with respect to the sanitation and hygiene, and that can further augment the issue of AMR. And next is global spread of resistant strain. This kind of spread can become issue for the entire global community. And lastly, it is economic burden for the individual as well as for the entire nation. So that is something in the heading 1 you can talk about with respect to the concerns related to AMR. In the heading 2, you can talk about the measures that can be taken to address the AMR. Firstly, you can talk about surveillance. Over here, there should be proper idea that how exactly we are tackling this kind of antimicrobial resistance and how we are exactly monitoring them through surveillance. There are certain kind of organization like INFAR over here which helps with respect to the surveillance of AMR. Second, we have promoting responsible use of antimicrobials. Over here, we are talking about regulation, restricting the over-the-counter sale and monitoring agricultural use. Next is One Health approach. Over here, we are talking about interconnectedness of human, animal and environmental health. We have seen that how government is pushing towards One Health approach to ensure that issues of AMR are resolved. Next is education, educating healthcare professional and public. Over here, we are talking about awareness. And lastly, we are talking about international collaboration, collaborating with different countries as well as organizations to tackle this global issue in a holistic way. So that is something you can talk about. You can also talk about certain kind of declaration, Jaipur Declaration on AMR. So that is something you can write in the heading 2 of this body. Now let's move to the conclusion. Over here you have the opportunity to talk about initiative taken. As in, if you see the flow, we have talked about the concerns, we have talked about the measures that can be taken. So in the conclusion, you have the opportunity to talk about certain kind of measures that are already taken by the government. Firstly, we have National Action Plan on AMR, where there are certain guidelines, there are certain kind of proposals that are kept to ensure that the AMR is limited. Next, we have ICMR's surveillance network, which is helping with respect to the surveillance of the spread of resistance or antimicrobial resistance. And lastly, we have ICMR's AMR research and international collaboration, where we have sufficient capacity to understand the nature of AMR, as well as we are also collaborating with other countries for information and intelligence exchange. So that is all for question number 3. Let us see the model answer and understand how can we inculcate the same in our answer writing practice. Firstly, in the introduction, you can give certain kind of recent context. You can give data points to justify your introduction. Nextly, you can talk about the concern, then measures, and lastly, you can talk about certain initiatives taken by India. So this is something for question number 3. You are writing for Vajiram's free initiative of answer writing practice. This month we are going to do GS1, where we are going to see questions from history, society and geography. You can see and attempt those questions at vajiramis.com. You can see the model answers and video discussion over here at YouTube. So keep writing and thank you so much.